This might be one of my favorite fights on the schedule. Great title fight. I'm going to lean towards the champion Volkanovski retaining his belt. I think he's just looked a little bit more consistent. Obviously, Brian looked great last fight. Before that, he didn't look so great. So I'm going to say Volkanovski gets it done by decision.
Alex Volkanovski and Brian Ortega. I love this fight. What a phenomenal matchup, and much more interesting now after seeing Brian Ortega's dismantling of the Korean Zombie in his last fight. Now look, Volkanovski, whether you thought he won the last Max Holloway fight or not, does not make a difference here. The fact that he had a first win over Holloway in that first fight speaks volumes. I mean, this guy is incredible, and I think he is very underrated as a champion here. Now, Ortega certainly has improved his stand-up, and we obviously know his bread and butter is the ground game, but I still like Volkanovski in this fight. I think he's more of a complete fighter, and we've just seen more body of evidence, more body of work, I should say, in the octagon from Volkanovski in terms of level of competition, who he's beat. I mean, this guy has been outstanding for, throughout his entire UFC career, whereas Ortega, he's had a few setbacks. I know he's a new fighter, but I got to go with what we've seen on paper, and that is Alex Volkanovski. I think he gets a decision here over Brian Ortega for the featherweight title.
So Brian Ortega versus Alexander Volkanovski. We saw Brian Ortega in his last fight, and he'd improved technically so much with his striking, but we seem to maybe forget how good Volkanovski is with his striking. Outstruck Max Holloway for large portions of two fights. And we saw what Holloway did to Calvin Kattar recently. I think that's just too much of a gap to broach. I think this will probably go 5 rounds. I think it will be close, but I think Alexander Volkanovski will win the unanimous decision here over Brian Ortega.
Volkanovski. I think Volkanovski right now is the third greatest featherweight who ever lived. Brian Ortega has looked absolutely phenomenal, but again, every single time you see Volkanovski fight, it's a different Alex Volkanovski. Like, he game plans specifically for his opponent. So the Volkanovski you saw against Max, the 2 Max fights, the Aldo fight, the Chad Mendes fight, is not the Volkanovski you're going to see fight Brian Ortega. I just think we saw one great performance from Brian Ortega after that long layoff. So I favor Volkanovski, but it is the definition of an incredibly high-level martial arts competition, and I can't wait for it.
Why do we keep disrespecting Alexander Volkanovski? Now look, Ortega is one of my favorite fighters inside and outside of the cage, but Holloway did to Calvin Kattar in a lot of ways what Max Holloway did to Brian Ortega. There's a reason Volk is the champion. There's a reason, however you scored those first 2 Holloway fights, that they are 1A and 1B in this division. Alexander Volkanovski is no joke. He is the best featherweight around, and him and Max Holloway are the best featherweights we have ever seen, right up there with Jose Aldo. So all the credit in the world to Brian Ortega and all the improvements that he's shown, but there is no reason in my books to be disrespecting Alexander Volkanovski and doing anything other but making him the clear favorite in this fight.
Alexander Volkanovski versus Brian Ortega. Man, this is a tough one. And it kind of goes a little bit back to the Peter Yan thing, where I said we just haven't seen Peter Yan get dominated in the UFC or lose, anywhere, or even like I'm not sure if Peter Yan's even lost a round. But when I think of Volkanovski, it's kind of the same thing. Like, we just haven't seen him get his butt kicked. We've seen him maybe lose close competitive rounds to Max Holloway. In fact, I thought Max Holloway won the rematch with Volkanovski, and but it was obviously a very close fight. This fight is very different. Ortega is just such a different fighter than Max Holloway. Man, I'm just a big Ortega fan, and I'm just picking Ortega, and I really don't have a clear reason why. I just think that I think actually Ortega's boxing is going to be able to withstand Volkanovski's kind of pressure, and usually, Volkanovski's like, what is Volkanovski? I'm trying to think what Volkanovski does well. He's just he really seems to control the fight, and you really have to fight his style. You're never like even when Volkanovski is maybe losing a round, you still think it still looks like Volkanovski is still fighting his game though. He's not trying to catch up to his opponent. And that's what Max Holloway was always great at. When you fight Max Holloway, you seem like you're always fighting Max Holloway's game. Now, can Ortega do the same thing? I think Ortega will win. I think he will learn from the loss, his championship loss to Max Holloway. And I feel bad because Volkanovski is like just such a nice guy. Almost going back to when I talked about Jan Blachowicz. It's like the guy's so nice. How can he be this good? Like when I think of great fighters, there's got to be something weird about them. There's got to be a screw loose. And Volkanovski just looks like a nice kind of family dude. So I'm gonna pick the weirdo Brian Ortega.
Ooh, yeah. I like this fight. I like this fight a whole lot. The Brian Ortega that we saw against Korean Zombie was a mastermind with the hands, and that was always like his weakness. Like, one, he didn't have the best as far as just pure stand-up striking was concerned. I mean, you think back to Max Holloway literally correcting his form in the middle of their fight, but he also was a guy who was always playing catch up, and that worked very well until he ran into Holloway, and he would just get beaten down and then somehow find this Hail Mary submission to pull out a victory. I don't think that strategy works on a guy like Volkanovski. You can't really do that to him. He's someone who I think just once the momentum builds up, it's just going to keep going and keep going and keep going, and you're going to find yourself overwhelmed. Not necessarily to the same level of output as Holloway, but you're going to be so distanced from what you want to do and what you need to do to win this fight. I'm not sure if that Ortega exists anymore. That's the thing that we're seeing here. I'm really not sure. He always has that opportunistic submission, but man, with those hand skills, the way they looked against Korean Zombie, he just might do it. He just might do it. And I once again, I hate to be the guy who's gonna look over someone who is very deserving, because I picked against Volkanovski for the first Holloway fight. I got to pick him against him again. I think Ortega just might do it. If he comes in looking the way he did against Korean Zombie, I don't think there are many people that can beat him. Very, very few. And considering the physical dimensions that Volkanovski has, someone with that sharp precision striking, it's going to be very difficult to close that distance, very difficult to really get your game going. And then on top of that, he has the opportunistic submission game just waiting in the tuck. So I got Brian Ortega winning this one.
I am tired of all the Alexander Volkanovski disrespect. All right. Yes, he had two good fights with Max Holloway, a fan favorite. We all love Max Holloway. The second fight was extremely close, and I thought could have been scored for Holloway. I went with Volkanovski. So I'm going with Volkanovski here too. I think people need to understand this guy is really good, especially at neutralizing his opponents. And it doesn't always make for the most appealing fights. Maybe the first Holloway Volkanovski fight, and maybe the Volkanovski Aldo fight too. But guess what? It does result in wins, and I think it will again at UFC 260.
I like Alex Volkanovski. I don't really see a path back for Brian Ortega. Ortega, for being such a good grappler, has terrible takedowns. He couldn't get Max Holloway down. I don't think he'll get Volkanovski down. And on the ground, I think Volkanovski is a much better striker. He's just gonna kind of pick Ortega apart. I think the win over Zombie was a good one, but it was just 2 fights ago we got absolutely destroyed against Max Holloway. So I don't think Volkanovski will finish him, but I think Volkanovski gets a decision.
I'll go with Volk. I think that he has completely surpassed the type of fighter that he was in the previous Max Holloway fights and whatnot. And I think that he's going to be a hard to beat type of champion. And I think Brian Ortega poses a different threat to him, but nothing that he can't deal with. So I think Volkanovski retains.
I like Volkanovski here. I think Brian Ortega looked incredible against the Korean Zombie, but Alexander Volkanovski, considering the fact that he's the featherweight champion, is so underrated. I think the Max Holloway fights had a lot to do with that, particularly the rematch. But Volkanovski is so freaking good. He has no, major holes in his game. He's a great stand-up fighter, great on the ground. Really built like a truck for the 145-pound division. I think he can just sort of outpoint Ortega on the feet and probably sort of neutralize Ortega's grappling with his wrestling. So I like Volkanovski to edge this fight out.
Brian Ortega, he came back after a couple of years and just showed us that we should never, ever think about ring rust. And he went out there and he did it against Korean Zombie. Volkanovski's been pretty flawless in his UFC run so far. Well, he has been flawless. He hasn't lost a fight. The closest fight he's lost was to the champ, which is almost lost. Sorry. It was to the champ, Max Holloway. I don't know. I believe that Volkanovski has a good enough like submission defense to stay out of big problems on the ground with Ortega. I don't even really think this fight is going to go to the ground. I think it's going to be contested on the feet. And from what I've seen, I think Volkanovski will be able to land more power shots in this fight. I feel Ortega is more stationary compared to Max Holloway, and he'll be able to plant his feet and land some big bombs against Ortega. And I see this fight going into the championship rounds, and possibly Volkanovski gets a late finish or just a decision win.
I love that fight so much. It's so good. And it's very difficult because Alex Volkanovski is kind of turning into the guy that is continually counted out in every fight for the most part. At least on my end, I was feeling that way about him. And now I'm like, okay, we need to really give this guy appreciation. He should be the favorite in these fights. But then we see how good Brian Ortega looked, and I'm like, man, I think I'm going to count him out again, because Brian Ortega, absolutely dangerous everywhere now. I mean, he was already dangerous everywhere, but the fact is that his striking is just a whole lot better, you know, as we saw against Chan Sung Jung. And if he looks that good again with his submission game in his back pocket, that makes for a very tough matchup for Volkanovski, I think. And when it just comes to who's a better finisher, Brian Ortega is that guy, and he is never out of a fight, as we saw pretty much on his whole run up until the title shot. You know, he had a lot of Hail Mary victories, people might forget. So I'm going to go with T-City on this one, even though I just admitted I probably shouldn't count out Volkanovski. I'm going to again.
I think Ortega could win this fight. But, you know, I say that Volkanovski, he's the kind of guy with the kind of style that you pick against every fight, and then he just wins. And that's basically what Volkanovski does best. Does he wrestle best? Does he strike best? No, he wins best. That's what he does. He just wins. And so with Ortega, I think it's hard to sort of look at Volkanovski and think, well, there's a way he can win this fight, but he often does. I mean, I wouldn't have picked him against Max, and he won 2, allegedly. So I'm going to lean towards Ortega, but it wouldn't surprise me if the champion defended his title. Fightful.com